Thanks. And good morning, everyone. So today's webcast is part of a four-part series. We're on the third now about coolOrange software, right? So a couple of weeks ago, we discussed how powerJobs can help with consumable file generation. Last week, we discussed how powerJobs could help with ERP communication. And today, we're going to dive into powerEvents, which is another one of the software packages available from coolOrange. And we're going to see how it can enhance the Vault Lifecycle behavior. We'll also be talking toward the end about one of Hagerman's products, Lifecycle Connection, which kind of is in the same vein, but it's much more specific and targeted and behaves a little differently. So if you have some very specific needs, Lifecycle Connection might be a good fit. If you've got more generic needs or a lot of different needs for enhancing the Vault Lifecycles, powerEvents is probably going to be your best bet. And we'll go through a few different scenarios of, different behaviors that you might want in association with Vault Lifecycles that just can't be done out of the box, but with powerEvents can be done in a pretty straightforward way. So, again, the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about coolOrange. If you were in the first two webcasts, this might be a little bit redundant for you, but for those of you who weren't able to join, we're going to cover, coolOrange as a company just a little bit. Then we'll get into discussing what powerEvents is and how it works, and then get into the specifics of how the software can be applied to real-world situations. So briefly about coolOrange, it's founded in 2009 by former Autodesk employees. They've got tons of experience in data management, software development, hundreds of projects successful worldwide, with resellers, different countries over the last 8 years or more. So this is a well-established company, has deep roots in the Vault world. They developed Vault Data Standard and still maintain that for Autodesk. They've created some custom jobs for the out-of-the-box job processor. And I believe they're working on something with Fusion Lifecycle integration as well. So to get into some of the products that coolOrange offers, they fall into three major buckets of functionality or behavior. The first would be loading data into Vault, be it importing from disk or from a competitive system like EPDM or Windchill, something like that. Maybe a legacy system, or even merging vaults together. If you've ever needed to or investigated the possibility of merging different vaults, be they on the same server or different servers, it's not a trivial process, especially if you need to keep history. There's no real good way to do it, other than using a tool provided by Autodesk that's provided only to resellers and consultants. But coolOrange has some really nice tools that work in conjunction with that Autodesk tool to make it easier to make sure you're getting your data loaded in the right way. They're enhance type products, enhancing Vault behavior. This is where most people need, if you really look at how you're using Vault, unless you're using Vault Basic, you could probably make use of one of their enhanced type products, being either powerJobs or powerEvents. From a powerJobs standpoint, more flexible, like PDF publishing jobs or sending data to ERP, for example. And what we're going to see today with powerEvents, process automation. So, enforcing processes especially, or enabling business processes in Vault that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And then the last bucket here, connect type products. They have a product called PowerGate, which enables bi-directional communication between Vault and ERP systems or Fusion Lifecycle to, cloud sites. And PowerGate would serve sort of as the incoming messages to enable other systems to talk to Vault. And then, as we saw in my webcast last week, powerJobs could even be used to send data to a cloud system like Fusion Lifecycle. But again, this series of webcasts is really focusing on just the enhanced products, powerJobs and powerEvents. So we'll dive into powerEvents now and what it can do for lifecycles specifically, right? So a big one is what's sometimes referred to as a 4 eyes release process, meaning more than one person needs to see something before it gets released. There's no good way to do that in Vault out of the box. But also things like custom validation. So we have some very specific things we can do with Vault out of the box. We can restrict file lifecycle changes based on properties compliance. We can restrict based on security, of course. We can restrict based on release status of children, or association with an item in a file, making sure the file's up to date. There are some basic restrictions there, but that's really the limit of it. If we've got a more complex decision to make about whether or not something should be released, for example, you really don't have the ability out of the box to introduce any kind of logic to that decision. So that leaves a lot of, what might be complex workflows, out of the realm of Vault. And I think that also sort of stunts its ability to be a more enterprise-wide solution for managing business processes, especially. Some other things like, for example, checking with ERP. So maybe we don't need to send data to ERP, but maybe we need to make sure that the necessary data is there before we release a part, or make sure that something hasn't changed in ERP that would invalidate this release. We could, during the lifecycle change process, make a call to ERP and make sure everything's all good there, and then if it's not, prevent the lifecycle state change. And we could maybe fast forward life cycles. I've got somewhat of an example like that today, although it's a little more complex, but maybe in certain situations, you need to skip over some life cycle states. Maybe, so for an example, like a expenditure approval process, for example, where if the, dollar amount being requested is below a certain amount, maybe it doesn't need to go through additional approvals, or maybe it does. You could, intelligently direct the life cycle state change to another state down the line based on property information, where a user doesn't have to, make that decision and make the clicks themselves, right? So there are a lot of different ways when you start to think about it, how something like powerEvents could help with Vault. And we'll, in just a second, we'll get into sort of the anatomy of a lifecycle state change and the different parts of it that you can interact with, and that might spur you thinking into how you might apply powerEvents to some processes you'd like to have in Vault, but maybe doesn't really do well out of the box. So just quickly about powerEvents and its nature, what it is, what its requirements are. It is technically an add-in for Vault Explorer. So if you're going to use it in your environment, you need to have it on every computer where users need to, have the advanced behavior. But that means its requirements are essentially the same as Vault Explorer. What's really neat about powerEvents, though, is that the custom scripts that you create to interact with the events in Vault apply to any application on that computer that uses the web services library. So that means PowerVault and powerJobs, so, and the Vault client itself, of course, but also the autoloader, if you need to do something, because they're more than just lifecycle events, and we'll get into this next week, but more than just lifecycle events can be manipulated by powerEvents, because there are events that fire when a file gets added to the Vault, or when a file gets checked in or checked out. We'll see this next week. And that would get in more into the fact that powerEvents also integrates with Inventor and AutoCAD. It just sort of does so because those all use that same web service to interact with Vault. And finally, even custom applications you might create. So you don't have to do anything special in your custom applications if you've got some that use this web service library in order to make powerEvents integrate with it. The fact that powerEvents is installed on the computer, it sort of plays that role of interacting with the events and runs its scripts in response to those. Right. So a bit now about how powerEvents works, and again, getting into the anatomy of a web service call. And again, this is not just file lifecycle state changes, but again, adding a file, checking in, checking out, item lifecycle state changes, change orders. They're maybe a little bit different than files. This is specifically about files. But in most cases, the idea is generally the same. There are four sort of things that happen when you try to take an action in Vault. The first is an event called get restrictions. Essentially, this is checking to see whether or not the action you're about to take is allowed. Now, out of the box examples would be trying to check out a file maybe that someone else has checked out. It's not going to let you. Or making a lifecycle state change of a drawing when one of its parts is not released. In that case, if the lifecycle transition is marked to prevent changes unless all the children are released, out of the box, Vault's going to say you can't do that, right? And so when that event fires, with powerEvents, we can actually hook in to that event and say, we're going to piggyback on this thing, and we're going to introduce our own check. And if it doesn't pass our check, we can say, no, you're not allowed to make that transition in this case. So for example, we checked ERP, the part's obsolete in ERP. That means you really shouldn't be releasing a new drawing about it, right? So no, we're not going to let you release that file, right? So that's one of the things we can do with powerEvents. That's one of the basic behaviors that we can interact with. And that interaction, if we prevent the state from happening, none of the rest of this even happens, right? So you don't have to worry about, data integrity in your Vault, or, yeah, we checked to see if they could do it and they can't, so we got to roll something back. It just completely prevents it, right? So you don't have to worry about it. Now, in other cases, yes, what the user's requested to do is perfectly fine, but maybe we need to do something in preparation for the event actually happening, right? So before we make that lifecycle state change, we need to maybe do something else in the system. Like thinking off the top of my head even, maybe when you are going to release a file, maybe it, needs to be a folder, it needs to go into a certain folder, it needs to be moved or something like that. In theory, you could create a folder before the file ever gets released and do something to it, or anything that you might need to happen before the file actually gets released. Then the web service call happens, the actual work that the user requested. In that case, maybe the file will actually change state. And then what's really nice about this, and what I think most of my examples apply to, aside from the restrictions, are this post event. So you get the ability to react to this, again, using the example of a lifecycle state change, you get the ability to react after the state change has happened. So now the file is now in the new state. It is there, that version has been created in Vault, and now you can do anything else you might need to do. For example, queue up a job for the job processor to handle to automatically print out a hard copy in the shop. So you could set it up to where, maybe your shop's not ready to go paperless. They need hard copies of things once they get released. You could set it up to where hard copies magically appear at the right printer based on when the file gets released and maybe what type of part it is. You can automate what really would be a multi-step, multi-person process of maybe even notifying the person, them finding the file, opening it up in a viewer, printing it out. Instead it could go right to the station that it needs to go to. So there's so many things that you can do with powerEvents to automate processes. I mean, when you really start to think about it, if there's anything that you're doing today that you think should be easier or that you wish you could eliminate some steps out of, and those steps are always the same way, same thing every time, you should really think about powerEvents and how you can employ it to remove some of those steps or automate them. So aside from hooking into those events, the way it works is very similar to powerJobs, actually. It's built on PowerShell. The scripting is all in PowerShell. And because of that, again, like we mentioned with powerJobs in the last couple of weeks, it can use .NET assemblies. That includes CAD APIs. In the case of powerEvents, one thing to keep in mind is you're interrupting a user's action in the Vault or in Inventor or something else, right? So you got to be careful that what you're doing isn't going to take too long. Otherwise, the user is going to start to have a bad experience. So you wouldn't, for example, want to say, well, when we release, use powerEvents to maybe make a whole bunch of step files and put them somewhere. Probably don't want to do that, just because it's just going to, I don't know if it would impact timeouts in the Vault or anything like that, but that's really not what powerEvents is for. powerEvents is more for automating things. In the case of this, if you needed step files, that's where powerJobs would come in. Offload that need to create consumable files to some other computer and let the user get on with their work, right? But again, it lets you use those APIs if you need to for whatever reason. But it also uses PowerVault. We discussed this the last couple of weeks. It's a native PowerShell extension maintained by coolOrange that gives you some really handy commands to interact with the Vault if you need to. And it is free to use. Now again, my examples, and I think most decent application for powerEvents isn't going to do a lot of manipulating, especially files and such. Again, just because you want to keep the amount of time it takes for your event, your behavior in response to an event, you want to keep that time to a minimum so that the user can do what they were asked to do and then go about their next task, right? So let's now get into some scenarios, some real-world applications of how powerEvents can automate some processes and maybe enable some things that otherwise would be impossible or difficult with Vault. So the first one is something called 4-eyes review. So the basic idea is, maybe in our workflow, we do not want users to be able to release files that they created or edited, right? So we need to make sure a different person at least pretends to look at it, right? They at least take an action and say, yes, either I know it's okay or I've looked at it and it's okay, right? So, and maybe you don't have a dedicated checker, right? Only one job in my life have I had a dedicated checker. And in every other situation I've had, we all review each other's work, right? I will say, okay, I'm done with this, and then I'll have somebody else just take a look at it. I think that's really common. And so within a given Vault file lifecycle, any given person needs to have the permission, at least, to both move a file from work to review and remove a file from review to released. Because one day they might be the editor, the next minute they might be the checker on a different file, right? And there's no way to do that because you need to there's no way to do a 4-eyes type thing out of the box because you can't out of the box restrict, unless you get really kind of crazy with properties and such, you could always say, well, I don't even think that works, right? I mean, you'd have to have a bunch of different life cycles. It would just be a real mess, right? And powerEvents makes that pretty straightforward to do. In fact, powerEvents comes with it comes with a few sample scripts, I should say, right? So one of the sample scripts was this idea of validating properties. And this example was actually a person who edited the file should be the person who then releases it, right? So sort of like document ownership kind of thing. Well, I was able to literally change like two letters in here and then change the wording. So you see between these two scripts, there's virtually no difference here, except for the wording and a couple of letters. And that gave me a 4i's approval process, right? So the basic idea is I have a document here that's been released. Now I need to revise it and make some changes. I'm going to change its state to work in progress. Right? And so I was the last person to manipulate this file, right? So if I check it out, make some changes, and check it in, I will still be the last person to have manipulated this file. And now if I try to just release this without anybody looking at it, it's going to tell me I can't do that. And the reason is, it can only be changed to released by the user who did not last modify the file, in this case, administrator. Right? So I would have to log in as somebody else, right? So if I log in as, say, just another engineer, that engineer, who is now a different person, should be able to release that file. No problem. Right? And conversely, if I'm the engineer and I'm responsible for the next change, I equally will not be able to release this. Someone else, like maybe the administrator, would need to do that, right? So that is behavior you just cannot achieve out of the box with Vault. So if you're looking at improving processes and you're struggling with people maybe releasing files without somebody actually looking at it and you want to enforce that behavior, powerEvents can do that for you in a very straightforward way. So let's take a look at another scenario now, property update. Now, I've helped literally hundreds of companies now implement Vault, and a somewhat common need in larger work groups is to restrict lifecycle state changes based on property information. So one classic example was I had a customer who really wanted to be able to have a nice workflow where they captured the initials of the approvers for their documents, and they wanted to make sure that a file couldn't be released until that approval information had been captured. But then when you revise the document, it needs to go through approvals all over again. And so the approver information, all the UDPs in Vault, should get wiped out. Because if they don't, then it could just go through the approval, the release process again without anybody looking at it. Right, so again, the basic idea is, I've got a released document here. It's been approved by, PDQ in manufacturing and ABC in engineering, and by me, I'm the checker. And then when I run this back through the workflow, put it back to work in progress to bump the rev, ideally, I need these properties values to go away so that it doesn't accidentally get released before people weigh in on it again. And out of the box, you really need to rely on a user to empty those properties out. And they're likely to forget, especially the larger group you get, people have different aptitudes, and so somebody is eventually going to forget. Well, powerEvents, rather than just restricting, a transition, can actually automatically remove those properties for us when we make the transition, right? So I have another event that I've created that will automatically wipe out certain properties, right? So that when I change the state of this to WIP, it will automatically have wiped out those properties. what this should do, we'll see. So it was working a few minutes ago, and it maybe is no longer working. I promise it was working a few minutes ago. One of the things with powerEvents is, depending on how you write your events, it's going to apply to like every file lifecycle transition, right? Because, you know, inherently every file lifecycle event is the same. You know, you're changing a file lifecycle state. It's up to you then to react, you know, and decide whether the current change based on, you know, the lifecycle state that it's in, or the lifecycle definition that it's in, whether your particular event should apply to that or not. And so in writing these sort of little simple scenarios, I didn't get too in depth into checking for those things. And so I'm turning rules on and off in the background, and this one doesn't want to cooperate. But believe me when I tell you that these properties can be wiped out when something goes into a work in progress state, so that then they can be filled out again in the appropriate way by the right people and then eventually get released. So it's really a matter of data integrity in this case, is making sure that, you know, information that shouldn't be there actually isn't there. Right? So that's another scenario. And I mean, really anything that you need to do, be it not just wiping properties out, but if you need to populate certain properties based on, you know, behavior, like you need to like add, you know, the create date of the version in Vault would track like when something happened. But if you need that more explicitly somewhere else, you could use powerEvents to do that sort of thing as well. Right? Now, the third scenario that I have, and we just had a question come in, which I think might feed completely into this. Will powerEvents allow multiple checkers to advance change orders from check to review state unanimously in the change order list? Now that I say this about change orders, we'll get into that in a minute, but the next scenario sort of feeds into that, allowing the idea of multiple checkers or multiple, you know, multiple people needing to weigh in at some point, right? And this is I mean, I guess you might call it a weakness of workflow in Vault. Other systems that I've worked with, you know, provide this capability, and Vault lacks it for whatever reason. It's a complex prospect, but the idea is at some point in our workflow, we have multiple people that need to weigh in, be it checkers or maybe different departments, and we want to make sure that they can all weigh in when it's appropriate for them, when they have the time to do it. And we shouldn't have to wait, for example, for purchasing to say, okay, before operations even sees it. You know, in some workflows, maybe that's true. In other cases, we don't care when they weigh in. These people's decisions are not mutually exclusive. And so we just want to make sure that we get this into each of these people's hands, so that they can all see it, approve it as quickly as possible, and then get it moving along the line. And I've tried to work out behavior like this in the past in Vault, and it's really kind of tricky because, you know, you can have like a group approval state, for example, here, and then, you know, someone could advance it to, say, a purchasing approval state, and then maybe the purchasing approval state can really go to all the other states, and then you have to, you know, pick the right one for the appropriate user, and it gets really, really hard to keep track of all of that. And ideally, what you'd like to do is just have, you know, each person log in, execute a lifecycle state change, indicating their approval by picking the appropriate state, and then, you know, have it really stay in this group approval state, so that other people know it's still in the group approval stage, and then eventually, when the last person weighs in, whoever that happens to be, then it moves along, right? Just like the workflow shows. You know, at any point along the line here, any of these people should be able to weigh in, and then once the last person does, then it moves on to the linear part of the process, right? So we should be able to do that in Vault, right? So I've got a drawing here. It's a work in progress, and it's in a special workflow that ultimately does include all of the different states that we see here, right? And now, once I change the state of this drawing from WIP to group approvals, then, and the way this is set up for, in the interest of time, if nothing else, I can make all of the approvals myself. But ultimately, what you would do is, you know, your purchasing group would only be able to, do, or production group could only do production approval, and your ops group could only do ops approval. So they would see that this is in the group approval stage. They could come in here and they could pick, okay, yes, I'm indicating my approval as ops. So I'm changing the state to ops approval, right? But notice, it looks like it didn't really go there, but it did. If you look down at the history, it did go into ops approval, but then it went right back to group approvals, right? But we can look in the list that we've had ops approval. And if I try to issue that approval again using powerEvents, I can say ops approval has already been provided. You've already done this. So even if a person isn't sure, like, okay, I'm not sure if I approve that, there's ample evidence, but, you know, if they're a new user, maybe they don't know, they could try, and it's not going to cause any trouble. You know, it's not going to issue another approval. But then as I issue these other approvals, again, we're going to get the same behavior. It's going to go back to that group approval state until eventually, once we've had all the approvers, now we've got marketing approval as well, and then eventually, once QA is the last to weigh in this case, once they weigh in, rather than going back to the group approval stage, it advances automatically to the final approval state. So we have captured, you know, we got ops approval, we got marketing approval, we got production approval, we got ops approval, we know when they did it, there's no chance of them actually doing it twice, and then it's ready to move down the line from final approval to released, right? So again, powerEvents behind the scenes there was checking to see, okay, did this group already approve it? If yes, prevent it. If they didn't, add to a list. And the way I did it just in this case was I'm keeping track of a little property, a semicolon delimited list of the groups that I've already approved. This does lead to some extra versions. You could certainly query the version history within that revision to see what historical states had been there. That would be another way to do it, and that would prevent an additional property edit, an additional version landing in the vault. But I chose to do it with properties. One of the nice things about this too is you can quickly look at the list and see who's approved it so far, right? But it enables this simultaneous workflow. Another workflow it could enable is more like a quorum type. So let's say, for example, rather than 4 different departments, you have 4 checkers. And you need at least 3 of the 4 checkers to say, yes, I agree with this. You know, but you don't need all 4, but you need at least 3. Well, you know, you could query the group that, you know, is associated with that, and keep track of the number of approvals that have taken place and keep track of who's approved it, so that you don't get duplicates. And then once you reach that quorum threshold, then it goes to final approval. So you could do not just a simultaneous approval, but you could actually do like a quorum type approval. So powerEvents can really open up the workflows and the capability of the workflows. Now, the big one that we didn't get to yet when it comes to lifecycle events and enhancing them is the idea of notification. This is probably the most glaring omission, I would say, of the Vault file lifecycles. I expect as a design decision by Autodesk, they have email built into the change order behavior. And, you know, I tend to think of the lifecycles, at least out of the box, in Vault as more housekeeping. You're more keeping track. Because out of the box, there's no notification. You don't have the idea of, you know, the complex flows. So you're really just keeping track of the status of a file. It's not, you know, enabling processes so much. But if you had the ability to do workflows like this, and if it had notification, it really could be a business process enabler and not just a tracking mechanism, right? And that's, again, something that powerEvents would allow you to do, is send out emails, right? Because remember, we have access like on the post event. So once a file gets released, for example, we could do lots of things. We could queue up a job. You know, we could release other files. You know, we could even send out an email, right, via PowerShell. And so that's what I've incorporated into this lifecycle as well. When we go from final approval to released, an email goes out to a particular party, you know, in this case, me, that indicates, you know, a new file has been approved and here's the file name, right? So, you know, you could have a big list of people it goes out to, like it could go out, an email could go out to, you know, each of those people, or an email could go out to all of these 4 people when it lands in the group approval stage. And if you want to, you know, spam people, you could say if one of these people approves, you could send a reminder email to the other 3 or the remaining unapprovers to say, okay, we've already gotten approvals from 2 of these people. We'd really like you to weigh in, right? So you can keep things moving in that regard. So it could not only be notification at the end of the process, but notification in the middle saying, hey, you've got something to do, right? Now, with powerEvents, again, creating the emails, it's relatively straightforward. This is some PowerShell code that I wrote that sends an email message, and the email, you know, message is pretty simple. It can be HTML. You can make it nice and pretty if you need to. But one of the downsides of powerEvents and emailing is it's going to be in a script somewhere, and you've really got to modify a script to add emails to transitions. You know, it's not super difficult, but you've got to know what you're doing and get into the code and distribute that. So that's where the Hagerman's Lifecycle connection would come in, right? So it uses the same basic idea as powerEvents would in this case, the idea that lifecycle, like events are firing. But what we've done with Lifecycle connection is we've provided a user interface. So it's very targeted, right? Lifecycle connection is only for sending emails and only on file lifecycle state changes. So it doesn't interact with items or change orders or anything like that, whereas powerEvents can interact with all of that. Where Lifecycle connection can be really useful is, again, the fact that we've got a user interface, right? So I can look at all of the lifecycle states in my Vault, and I can look at all of the transitions between those states, much like in the configuration dialog. But what it allows me to do is say for a given transition, I could say, you know, send a certain type of email. We have message templates. So if you've got the same message that needs to go out on a lot of different states, you know, you don't have to type it in every time. You know, and this is just showing that information. We can include who should get the email, right? But what we can also do with Lifecycle connection is we can say, for this particular transition, ask the user to provide additional information and give them the ability to pick and choose who should get the email. The script powerEvents is really designed to send the same type of email to the same people in the same way every time, which applies in a lot of cases, right? But if you need a little bit more complex behavior around your emailing notifications, you might consider our Lifecycle connection product, right? And so just to show you how this would work, this goes from work in progress to released. It's going to pop up a box asking for some additional comments. And in this case, it's going to allow me to specify additional recipients from the vault. Right? And then it's going to send off the email. Right? So again, Lifecycle connection gives you a little bit more flexibility, and it's a little bit easier to configure the emails. So if you've got a lot of process automation needs, you know, there may be a lot of benefit in getting powerEvents for all those other things, and then maybe also, you know, incorporate, you know, some email notification that way. But if you've got real, you know, specific needs around email, and the Lifecycle connection UI would make it easier, you know, you could look into that as well, or both, right? And that's something that we can help you with, you know, as well, understanding what your needs are and then recommend one, the other, or both. So when it comes to the software, we can sell you powerEvents if you'd like. We can help with installation and configuration. We can create turnkey events based on your needs, so like provide to you the script to do the thing you need it to do. We can also provide training and enablement as well, so that you can create your own and maintain maybe some ones that we make for you. So for that, we'll open it up with additional questions. And again, to get back to this first question, will powerEvents allow multiple checkers to advance change orders from check to review state unanimously in the change order list? That's a really good question. If it was files, I would say absolutely. I believe you should be able to with change orders. What it comes down to is the change order events and how you can react to them. So the coolOrange website does have some great documentation about their products, especially if your browser is not acting up. And in the powerEvents, in the code reference, there is a reference for the different types of events. And so for our change orders, if we look down here, here are all of the change order events we have. So adding, edit, commit, update change order state, right? So this is the information about what you can do. So I'd have to look, and maybe I can get back with you more specifically if that would be possible to make sure. But, you know, there is a pre and a restrictions. So in the case, so what you would have to do in that case is you would have to tie into the restrictions. Yeah, I'll look into it, but I'm not sure it's possible, because you'd either have to completely prevent it, in which case, I mean, maybe it would be confusing to the user, because if you allow it, if you let it go past the restrictions stage, it's going to go to review. So you have to prevent the checkers from actually advancing it, while also keeping track of the fact that they had done it. And I'm not 100% sure if you can do that. I'll look into it. But that's an interesting question. So essentially, I think what it comes down to is, if you're talking about a Vault change order, it has the idea in here of you can do unanimous approval in the review state, but you cannot do unanimous approval in the check state. Work to check and check to approve, this is all a single person taking this action, and that's it. So if you could introduce unanimous approval here as well, that would give you like 2 unanimous approval states. But if it's not possible there, and I'm thinking it's not, but I'll give it some thought, then you could potentially start to use the file-based lifecycles with powerEvents because it could introduce the idea of unanimous approval at a given state for how many ever unanimous approval states you actually needed. And I know in other systems that don't have the idea of this explicitly different change order record type, they just use a file record or a record in the system of some sort that goes through a workflow that meets the same criteria, right? So that would be another option. The fact that powerEvents can expand the file-based lifecycles gives you more opportunity, because you could certainly create a file-based lifecycle with powerEvents that mimicked this behavior. So any other questions? So it's been a little bit. I haven't seen anything else come in, so I think we'll wrap it up just with a reminder that not only do we sell, coolOrange software, but we also sell data management solutions, Vault, of course, but also a couple of other ones. They may or may not meet your needs better than Vault. We can help you make that decision. And we also provide simulation services. We have tons of simulation experience. We can get you training. We can do the actual analysis for you, whatever your needs might be. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ashley, and I appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you, Forrest, and thanks for everyone for attending today. This will conclude our broadcast. If you think of additional questions later, you can simply reply to that confirmation or reminder email you received excuse me, from GoToWebinar, and we can get those to Forrest or your sales rep to get them answered. Thanks for attending, and have a great day, everybody.